For the questions, for the Q&A, would you like it to have a little bit more time, or should we do an hour, 60 minutes, or sorry, 75 minutes for the conversation and then Q&A?
Yeah, I would say like around an hour panel and then Q&A half an hour.
Okay.
But also, like, depending if there are only 2 questions, then you can of course have a little longer.
That's what I meant. Yeah.
Panel, but like depending on the sum of questions coming in.
Okay.
But you can decide spontaneously how you
All
feel,
right.
how the discussion is going. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
If there are no more questions, I would open the waiting room now.
Hello to everyone. We will start in 2 minutes. We just wait and let everyone come in. So, hello and welcome everyone to our online discussion series called Reframing Reproduction, where we are going to talk about reproductive rights, self-determination and intersectional justice every second Tuesday from now on. I'm Jana Prosinger. I'm the head of the Global Unit for Feminism and Gender Democracy of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation. And I would also like to introduce and thank to my colleagues Delia Binishik from the Gunnar Werner Institute and my 2 colleagues in my team, Naida and Atna. And together we have designed this online series. The freedom to decide over one's own body and reproduction is still a privilege in today's world. And whether or not to have children and how to raise them is a very personal choice, but also a choice with political implications. These online discussions will hopefully enable us to look beyond the reproductive health and rights label and more deeply analyze the power relations and biopolitics and also the discriminatory structures that have laid the groundwork for injustice, anti-feminist movements and reproductive repression in today's world. We will talk in this series with activists, academics, and decision makers on the topics of contraception, abortion, birth, reproductive technologies, reproductive justice as a concept. And today we will take a closer look at population policies. This event will be live streamed and also recorded. The time zone was selected in order to ensure that as many people as possible from all over the world could join in. Although it might be quite early for some of you and for others quite late, and again for others in the middle of their workday, we hope you will all enjoy and be inspired by this panel. Each of our panels will begin with a guided discussion and followed by a Q&A. For French, Spanish, and German speakers, translation is available by clicking the interpretation icon in the lower right corner. And now I have the honor to introduce our moderator and facilitator for the whole event series, Sham Jaff. Sham is a journalist and political scientist based in Berlin. She writes the weekly newsletter, What Happened Last Week, on underreported news from Asia, Africa, Latin America. And Jeff is also the host of several podcasts and was awarded with a Grimme Online Award 2021. So welcome, Sham. We are happy to have you. And I hand over to you from now on.
Thank you so much, Jana, and a warm welcome to everyone. I am so excited for this, for today's event, for today's panel discussion with our amazing panelists. But before I introduce them to you a little bit, well, Jana gave a really good introduction into the topic. I think when I was approached by the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung to moderate these discussion series, I think population policy was one of those terms that I hadn't heard about in a very long time. And so I want to start with an introduction about this very complicated field, and I'm sure that our panelists will also shed some light on why it is so complicated and why maybe it doesn't have to be. So I want to start with a very simple fact. In 2021, last year, the population of the Earth reached 7.8 billion. In some places on Earth, birth rates are decreasing, and in others, they are increasing. And there's a lot of debate and policy around that fact. And today's panel is exactly about that. It's about population policy. It's about, it's a term that I, as a feminist living in the West, particularly have not heard about very often, but has very much to do with feminism. It's a term that explains all the different political measures that states take to change the size and composition of how many people live in which country, and specifically which people live in which countries. And so there are like a lot of laws, a lot of policy programs, a lot of campaigns that are being launched. In short, states, countries, governments, they intervene either by promoting birth or by reducing birth. There's also another way to control populations, which is through migration and immigration policy. I myself have talked a lot about migration policies in Europe, but specifically with population policy, sometimes they coexist together because, you know, they can, depending on the objective, these measures can target particular social groups as well, just like migration policies. And the fact is, while in the global north, in the so-called global north and the West, people are encouraged to have children, in the global south, programs of so-called development aid tend to aim at reducing the birth rate. And many feminists and activists from those affected regions actually see population control it's in this global south. You know, they sometimes see that it's a disguise, it's a woven disguise, and because it is being sold as feminism. But often those population policies have racist, classist, ableist, and anti-queer elements to them, and they also seek to perpetuate colonialist forms of oppression. What we do know today is that the issues of population policy and sexual and reproductive rights, they remain very controversial around the globe. And that is why we are here today in conversation with one another to shed some light on why something so actually easy to understand is, well, basically the right to freely decide to have children, the right to freely decide not to have more children, and the right to self-determined parenthood free from repression and violence. Why those things that are actually easy to understand, why they have become so controversial and so absent from our mainstream feminist discourses around the world, particularly in the West. So the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung and I, we warmly welcome our three experts on this topic. And I don't know why my filter kind of goes back and forth. I think it's too sunny in Germany. I know this is a very strange thing to say, but that is what I'm dealing with today. But I'll try to fix that once I have all the bios ready. But I want to warmly welcome our three panelists today. So first up, we have Setembiso Promise Mthembu, who's joining us today from KwaZulu-Natal, from South Africa. Hello, Promise. Welcome to this panel. Promise is the co-founder of Her Rights Initiative. She's a feminist, activist, advocate for the strategic interests of women living with HIV, and a researcher. Mthembu has worked in the field of HIV and feminism at the national and international levels for more than 20 years. Her interests and research are the politics of women's health, motherhood, and reproduction in post-colonial societies. Mthembu has also pioneered and led research and advocacy on the forced sterilization of HIV-positive women in South Africa, which we will talk about today. She served as researcher advisor on the same work in Namibia, Zambia, and Uganda. And in 2012, Mthembu served as a guest editor of Agenda Feminist's journal entitled The Politics of Women's Health in South Africa. She's also awarded a Doctor of Philosophy from the discipline of Gender Studies in the School of Social Sciences of the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And her thesis is entitled The Political Economy of Contraceptives in Post-Apartheid South Africa. Welcome to you, Promise. Thank you so much. Okay, the sun is migrating, so I will be migrating to the left. Next, I would like to introduce and welcome Susanne Schulz. Susanne Schulz is a private lecturer at the Institute of Sociology at Goethe-Universität in Frankfurt am Main, here in Germany. She researches power and domination relations around reproduction, human genetics, and population policy, as well as social movements in Latin America. She received her PhD in political science from the Freie Universität Berlin on international population politics and women's health movements. As part of a research project, she worked on the democratization of the political in German family and migration policy. In 2019, she habilitated on biopolitics of childbearing at Goethe-Universität in Frankfurt am Main. And she has taught political science, sociology, and gender studies at universities in Frankfurt am Main, Berlin, Vienna, and Graz, and was a 2021 Senior Fellow of the Maria Sibylla Merian Center Conviviality and Equality in Latin America program. She's an advisory board member of Genethisches Netzwerk e.V., a member of the editorial collective Kitchen Politics, active in Netzwerk Reproductive Gerechtigkeit Berlin, and in Femini, Feminist Initiative Against Reproductive Exploitation, and in other anti-racist feminist networks. She lives in Berlin, and I'm also so happy and so honored to welcome you to this panel, Susanne. And last but not least, I'm honored to introduce Andrea Peto too. Andrea Peto is a historian and a professor at the Department of Gender Studies at Central European University in Vienna, in Austria. Forgive me, my computer is, okay, sorry. She is and is a Doctor of Science of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. Her works on gender, politics, Holocaust, and war have been translated into 23 languages. In 2018, she was awarded 2018 All European Academies Madame de Staël Prize for Cultural Values. She is Doctor Honoris Causa of Södertörn University in Stockholm, Sweden. And her recent publications include The Women of the Arrow Cross Party, Invisible Hungarian Perpetrators in the Second World War, and Forgotten Massacre, Budapest 1944. She writes op-ed pieces for many international and national media. I'm sure you all agree with me. This is a great panel. This is a panel of experts, it's an amazing lineup, as someone has written in the chat that I just saw. And I am still struggling with the sun, but I will be going back and more into the corner. I have prepared, in preparation for this discussion today, I prepared individual questions for the panelists, because I wanted to make sure that everybody who is listening in on today, I wanted them to understand what it is that these amazing women do, and what it is that they can teach us about how we should think about population policy. Let me just try and see if I can, I'll do that later. I want to see if I can turn off my background so that you can see me a little bit better. But I want to start with my first question. Susanne, your research focuses on power and domination relations around reproduction and population policy, of course. But in mainstream feminist discourses in recent times, we've heard a lot about all but one term, which is population policy. It's something that we don't quite talk about as much. What does it mean? And where does this concept come from? And why do we not talk about it more often in our feminist discourses?
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation and already for your introduction, because you already said a lot of things about it. I think there is certainly like a liberal or also a global north feminism, which is quite reducing and decontextualizing what is having children about and reproductive rights, and often only looking at at body politics, maybe at gender politics, but above all about thinking it as a private decision-making issue of everybody. So that we have a long story of ignoring power relations. That's not true for every feminism. We have all this global South feminist history of resistance we have now. I think that's also why we are talking today here with this amazing other guests also about reproductive justice as a new framework, what is really addressing power relations also. And I think, yeah, we have also history in Germany, for example, of protest against population policy in the 80s. Yeah, so there is a lot of history, but now currently there's a very individualistic, choice-oriented way to talk about reproduction, and we should really think about that having children or not has to do with power relations and with government strategies, addressing population, addressing who should be born, who should reproduce and who not. And as you already said, this is a lot, has to do a lot with relations of racism, class relations, ableism, and so on. So there are always in the global and also in the national levels, government strategies who are thinking about how to frame, how to change, to shape the composition of population and the amount of population also. For example, in Germany, we have a family policy addressing the middle classes to have more children. Since more than 10 years, we have like a parental allowance that gives more money to middle class people when they earned more money. Income-related parental allowance called Elterngeld. And people who are unemployed or have less money get nothing or less. We have all this debate about assisted reproduction and who should be empowered to have children also via a lot of technological possibilities. But the same government in his development policies says we have to make a policy to reduce population growth in the global south. And that's an ongoing discourse. And that's a discourse even when we had Cairo, the UN population conference, and in 1994. We got this new words. Maybe this has also contributed: sexual and reproductive health and rights. This framework seems very feminist, very good. But in this conference, it was clear that the goal of it is going on to reduce population growth in the global south. So we have a very big ambivalent way to address women in the global south. And there's a lot of, we will hear a lot about strategies, how to frame this in a voluntary choice way, but at the same time make coercive policies, make policies very with the antinatalist bias, I would say, policies to address certain women in the global south, especially Black and indigenous and poor women, to reduce births. And maybe as a last comment is that what is important in feminism is not just to see these strategies or these power relations on the concrete level, but also think about the narrative of population. What is population about? If we can frame every social crisis in the world as a population problem, and here already the problem begins, because then we don't look at distribution of resources, the way of production, the fossil capitalism, the extractivism. We think about the addressing certain groups of population or amounts of population as a factor for solving these problems. And here already we have the situation that it's not all the population of the globe is addressed as the same way. We have always selective ways to say who is then the overpopulation. And this has to do with blaming the poor instead of poverty, or also, as Michelle Murphy, for example, has said in her book, population has always this grammar and also the ghost of racism. Population is like a form of talking about world's problems that is always connected to racist and classist ways to think. So maybe that would be my answer to your question. I didn't want to talk too much also.
Wow, Susanna, you've already mentioned so many of the things we would love to talk about at length today in our conversation. You mentioned democratization of those societal problems. You mentioned racism. You've mentioned so many of those intersections that we want to explore today. Andrea, you have just recently published an e-paper on how discourses on demography in the European Union institutions have evolved and why they have evolved in such way. Can you tell us a little bit about your findings?
Thank you very much for the invitation. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
And I owe an apology for all the viewers that you don't have this background, which is creating this elusive image, because I'm talking to you via my phone because I could not get in via my laptop. So, if this image is not that impressive, I'm sorry for that. So, you have heard in the introduction that I'm a solid historian who is working on 20th century and history of war and gendered violence during wartime. So what on earth I'm doing here on this panel? And the reason is that maybe the commentators can put this paper in the chat, that somebody else, those who are interested could download it, that with Livia Olah and Judith Götz and Svante Höft, we published a paper with the Böll Foundation about demography, how demography as a discourse has been hijacked by different political forces. And the reason, Judith Götz is a researcher of extreme right. I'm also coming into this picture from researching anti-gender movements and discourses of anti-equality movements. Swantje Höft is my MA student at Central European University in Vienna. So this is really the best thing what can happen to a professor, that you are working together with your colleague. And Livia Ola is a professor of demography at the University of Stockholm. So this is the dream. And I just want to say that this is also in brackets, that this is also a statement about present knowledge production, that you have got actually 4 colleagues who are working together in peace in a constructive way. So you don't have one person who is producing the knowledge, but you have got this group of people who actually wrote this paper. And the reason why we were interested in this is coming from 2 directions. One is the surprise that when the new commission was formed, there was a commissioner of demography. And for several, this was a real surprise. What on earth demography does as a job title on the European Commission. And the other reason why we were so much interested in this, that demography and population policy, which has been described so eloquently by Susan, they all have a progressive root. So they all came from, in the case of demography, at the end of the 19th century, with a zeal to change, to make the life better, to create a healthy, a happier society. And what we see now is that these policies are hijacked by different political forces. And I'm sure that there will be time to get in details about this. But now I just want to, highlight that these were the reasons why we wrote this paper. And the paper is based on the Twitter analysis of politicians on the European level, members of the parliament, important NGOs, different institutions. And I'm happy to talk about the findings later, but just a kind of summary is that it's really a mistake that the progressive forces let demography and also the population policy dominated, hijacked by the conservative and illiberal forces, by now mostly the liberal forces, who are misusing and using the built-in contradictions of these policies in order to normalize certain exclusionary practices. And that's why this lecture series, a workshop series, is so timely, because this is high time to think about how to take it back and think creatively about these issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I have to say, when I read the e-paper, I thought your e-paper was very timely, because in light of what's happening in Europe, specifically in the West, with all these new, with the elections, for example, also in Hungary, I think we all agree that it's an extremely interesting and timely field of research, and when I think we should talk about a little bit more in depth later on. Promise. In our conversation prior to this discussion today, we talked a lot about the term reproductive health, which you mentioned to me, is used almost only when we mean to talk about contraceptives. A lot of it gets lost. A lot of other topics get lost. What else does the term encompass, in your opinion?
Thank you very much, Sham, and to Heinrich-Böll and other panelists for this very interesting conversation. Yeah, and I think my colleagues, Joanna and Andrea, have started to unpack this idea of reproductive health, because it is a population policy and programs, basically silenced into the health language, silence into the reproductive, language, and seen as something that is always a positive. But when you look closer at these policies and programs, it says reproductive health, but when you look closer, it's really contraceptives, right? Because if you're talking reproductive health, you are basically talking about a reproductive health from puberty up until death, right? But you only have contraceptives programs that are just about contraceptives and not providing for all other, reproductive needs that you will have. I mean, for an example, things like, cancers, cervical cancer in our context in South Africa and in the developing world, this is a huge problem, issues of menopause, and many others. And as my colleagues have said, is that, contraceptives as part of the broader part of population policy, is really about state power that is imposed directly on women's bodies. It's presented as a medical intervention, so you see it when you dig deep, right? It's about governing women's bodies and deciding which women can enter and not enter the institution of motherhood. Because as my colleague has said, these policies will promote certain women to reproduce and have children and basically oppress others, unfortunately, the majority of women. It is about racism, and this is the situation, here in South Africa, as, is the case in other countries as well, the US, where this idea of contraception came from and was branded, as many things. I mean, Margaret Sanger, like people in the health sector celebrate her as, a pioneer of women's rights, someone who advocated for women's, agency and choice, but actually she was part of the eugenics movement, the movement that was obsessed about whiteness and containing the population of Black people in America. And she was targeting Black poor people, the slaves, with these contraceptives programs. And because it's part of racism, then it becomes a system, right? And if it is a system, an oppressive system, it has to have different layers. It has to be embedded in politics. It has to be embedded in political economy, which countries have power over others. So it will come as a form of colonialism, embedded in colonialism, neo-colonialism, and in our context, post-colonialism, and the whole sort of division of power and labor in the countries. You see the role of drug companies, for an example, in this establishment called contraceptives, how, these then will then be working with intergovernmental structures such as the United Nations, for an example, coming on board as philanthropists, the donors that are, giving money in good kind to the United Nations. But when you look closely, you realize that actually, they are there because they have power over these institutions. I was telling you an example of Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for an example, that they donate 10% of core cost of the World Health Organization at any given year, right? And over and above that, they have endowments that are, set aside for WHO, and that gives them power over how WHO drafts their policy. For an example, the global contraceptives policy now, which WHO is pursuing, the Family Planning 2020, that policy was advocated for, drawn and funded by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and WHO basically had to, sign on it, and when you look closer, you then realize that at about the same time, Bill Gates had invested in Pfizer, which is a drug company that is producing one of the contraceptives called Depo-Provera. Countries in, Europe, America, Canada have sued, on Depo-Provera. There's been a plethora of class actions on Depo-Provera since the 1970s. However, Pfizer are producing these contraceptives, which gets distributed in developing countries, embedded in aid. You see, the Sustainable Development Goals, for an example, they also have, contraceptives. So they're distributing it en masse, and they are also innovating it, in other forms, because basically now Bill Gates is in charge, of global health, right? And obviously their income and shares and everything else is increasing, So yeah, so to us, this is what this is about. Of course, you will find certain women and women of a particular class who will say contraceptives are good, because, for some women, it does allow them to exercise their, reproductive rights, and in some instances, you find that maybe there is a paradox here, but when you look at the bigger goal, this had nothing to do with women's rights. My colleague Johanna was talking about how they attach themselves, like in all the discourses and the ideologies, of the world. For an example, the 1994 ICDP conference, which was about liberation of women exercising their rights. They basically took over, and feminists who participated there, they really had to, compromise, come up with compromise language. But actually the population control establishment had taken over that, that particular conference. So you look like in South Africa, for an example, they were able to attach this ideology to the Union of South Africa, oppressive system that was led by the United Kingdom. And they did exactly the same with the apartheid political system of South Africa. It worked best for them. You look at what is happening in Israel and in Palestine, and they're able to attach themselves to those particular, discourses. We have a COVID epidemic now. They've taken it over. So analysis of, post-COVID world from a woman's perspective, gender perspective, contraceptives. You will see in Ukraine, solidarity goes to my colleagues from Eastern Europe, post-Ukraine war developments, the international community will be talking about contraceptives. Let's help the poor so that they reproduce less, because if they over reproduce, then we have problems, instead of addressing the real problems. Yeah, I think I'll stop there for now and allow the other colleagues, to share as well.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts,
Can I jump in? Or
yes, of course, sure.
You encouraged me in the preparatory meeting to jump in. So I just want to bring in one example what Promise was mentioning about Ukraine, and so those women who were raped and they are fleeing because of this unwanted pregnancy to Poland, Slovakia. Then they have serious issues of exercising their reproductive rights, because in those countries abortion is impossible. So in a sense, I just would like to give a different framing of this discussion, and thinking about reproductive rights, again, not as necessarily as a choice, but something which is connected to the present geopolitical conflicts. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, that's a very, very important way to reframe as well. And just like Andrea did, Susanna and Promise, please feel free to jump in any moment of the discussion. Also, a quick note to our audience: if you have any questions whatsoever, the team will be collecting your questions, and we have a lot of time for your questions. If there is anything that you would like to go in a little bit deeper in, feel free to ask, whatever. Susanna, I think you've unmuted yourself. No.
No.
Okay, well, I was gonna come. I had a question for you actually, because Promise had just stopped at the idea of the myth of the overpopulation, I say myth of overpopulation because it is a myth, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that? Is it a thing? Is it a real argument that people are making?
No, it's not a real argument, because it's like it's separating the factor population from resources, from our living conditions of social relations, and making from numbers, like saying then we can plan the optimum population for the globe. That's not possible, and say then there's an excess population and this is the overpopulation. But if you look at the ways, the narratives, the rationales, how this is done, it's always very reductionist. This is always looking at population as a variable and separating numbers of people from their social living conditions, from their from every structural situation of power relation of this globe. So I think it's a way, instead of looking at poverty, looking at the poor, blaming the poor instead of poverty. And there's a lot of reductionist thinking that demography, as Andrea already said, demographization always means to put the factor population in the front, and to make of social crisis demographic crisis. And this translation always is already the problem, because it addresses always some groups of people instead of the social structures to be solved. Yeah, but maybe I could also go on with some thoughts I had. Thank you very much for Promise and Andrea. I also wanted to comment about our experience here in Berlin, that Women in Exile, one refugee women organization, told us that often women they know coming, fleeing and migrating in a very hard way to come here, have an implant implanted in their arms from some refugee camps. Also in the saying you need in your migration process, you need this hormonal implant, hindering to get children on the way. And this is shown as a empowering thing, but they have often problems to remove this implant when they are here. And this is another example, as said, Promise already told us, another example of this very pharmaceutical-led form of new population policies we are currently observing with the Family Planning 2020, as Promise mentioned, as like a public-private partnerships between governments and pharmaceutical industry, and also this philanthro-capitalist foundations like the Gates Foundations especially. And they together have like a very technocratic way to think how to solve every problem in the world by focusing really on family planning and on contraceptives, and to distribute more contraceptives. And I could also give you some examples for it, if I can show you some screen. I don't know if you have time for this. Yeah.
Yes, please. Examples are always welcome.
I will, because it's important also to show what happened a little bit in the past with these programs, and to today. I wanted to show you, I'll see if it's possible. Can you see this now? Okay. I wanted to mention that there's a story also immediately after the Cairo conference, as Promise told us, was hijacking some of the feminist language, and a lot of big NGOs, feminist health NGOs, said, now we have Cairo, now we have reproductive health and rights. So they didn't consider what happened in Peru in these times. Immediately after the Cairo conference, there was a big sterilization campaign under an authoritarian government of Fujimori, especially addressed to indigenous and rural women, and 300,000 people were sterilized, often under coercive situations, like saying to the health workers they have to make certain quotas of sterilization every month, saying to the women you will be seen as subversive if you don't comply, if you don't get sterilized, or you don't get any more food aid, or even without informing during C-section to do these sterilizations. And we have a very long time tried to protest against it in the 90s. I got to know about it in the 90s. And we see also in Peru, there have been protests. But to show you let me see now the presentation first. What the German government said about this, when we asked them to what happens there, they say, that's the main objective of the country program, the German government says, is to support the Peruvian government's implementation of its national population program in order to meet unmet demands for reproductive health service, promote gender equality, and encourage responsible sexual behavior among adolescents. Responsible is very often also a means to make certain normative ideas how people have to behave and plan their children. And the next sentence was this relationship between a country's population development on the one hand and its social, economic, and ecological development on the other is obvious. They even don't have to explain why this is connected. Yeah? That the population narrative is so hegemonic that they even didn't have to explain. Then they said developing countries cannot therefore not to desist from, they can't desist, it's a wrong translation, they can't desist from developing population policy strategies and partly with the help of German development cooperation to implement them. So they say it's a necessary strategy to do this. And I have another example. Promise already told a lot about it, but I would show you also what's happening there. It's the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation who did this implant access program. So, Promise told us about the Depo-Provera part and Pfizer. And in Germany, we should also mention Bayer Healthcare company, Bayer as a company producing Jadel, producing these hormonal implants. And there was a really strong investments in the recent years to really increase above all this implant program. Implant program means that you have 5 years implanted this this hormonal implant, as for example, the Jadel, the product of Bayer Healthcare. And we see here on the right side this statistics, how they increased the share of this implant of all contraceptives used, and especially in which countries they did it. It's sub-Saharan African countries where they focus on, and they want really to have the maximum share rate of contraceptive used and above all implants used. And that has nothing to do with free decision making. We all fight, I think we all here fight for free access to contraceptives in a basic healthcare setting, to free access to abortion. But within healthcare, within broader healthcare, as Promise said, within broader reproductive healthcare, and with a goal just to make it possible if a person wants it, if the woman wants it, but not as a goal to make development policies connected to these goals, because then we have these coercive situations, and we have really the way to put these implants, which have side effects, which often makes migraine, makes irregular bleeding, makes depression, weight gain, and so on. So women in a hard living situation have this problem, and they often can't get it removed before this 5 years. So we have all these effects, direct coercive effects of this type of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Susanne, for all these ample examples. Promise, in a lot of ways, reproductive self-determination has also been taken away from a lot of women in South Africa. Your focus and your research has also been on the forced sterilization campaigns of HIV-positive women in South Africa. When did the country engage in forced sterilization, and how did the country get involved in this campaign? You're on mute, Promise, sorry. Yes.
Yeah, Suzanne, the implants. Yeah, so much to say, about them, their relationship to Depo-Provera, the forced, implants, women that are targeted, and also the fact that on the ground, health workers are trained and licensed to insert them, but not trained and licensed to, to take them out if women choose, to take them out. And the recent case, which was settled on implants on their side effects in Canada, yet the rate of uptake is, going up, you know, in countries like ours. So first, sterilizations in South Africa, the source is really the eugenics movement of late 1960s into 1970s. And how did it come about in South Africa? So around the 1960s and early 70s, and in the late 1940s into 1950s in South Africa. So you had the government of the Union of South Africa, which was led by the British and also local, you know, politicians, as it were, white politicians, Afrikaners. They identified a problem, a population problem that Black South Africans, the population of Black South Africans was increasing in urban areas, you know, and, you know, Black people had started to challenge, you know, power, oppressive power over them, you know, so they needed to come up with a strategy, a policy that would decrease Black population in urban areas and increase white population in urban areas. You know, at that point, the rate of reproduction for white South African women was 2, and for Black South African urban women, it was 6. So it was becoming problematic. You know, and also they identified a problem which they called the white poor problem, where they were realizing that poor white people were actually reproducing more than, you know, non-poor white, you know, people, and that poor white people were closer to Black people, right? They were beginning to have, you know, relations, marry Black people, were identifying more with Black people, you know, so also this policy was to target poor white and colored people, you know, so that they do not reproduce, because they, you know, producing this undesired, unpure, you know, white race, and that has a direct political implications. So it was for, you know, racial policy, purity, and, you know, clear-cut political management. You know, then in 1948, the apartheid state takes over, and the apartheid state, in as far as population and reproduction is concerned, you know, then draft a policy, which was codified in 1974. So the union went to as far as, you know, clearing the ideology and creating the environment. Then the apartheid state comes up with this policy in 1974, right? It's population control policy, but it's sometimes called the women's health policy. So basically this population says you target Black African women in urban areas with an injection called Depo-Provera, and also with sterilization, forced sterilizations. You know, they inject so much money on this policy. They build clinics, you know, everywhere, which are called women's health clinics, but actually they provide no service other than contraceptives, you know, services. So women are targeted post-labor wards, you know, you cannot go to door number 2 before you pass, you know, this particular clinic. And they were also in the city centers, you know, and I'm afraid that they were still there, you know, and massive investments in, you know, marketing and communication, you know, and of course, I mean, funding for this was not only coming from the apartheid state, you know, it was coming from international donors, you know, and the program would obviously be certified by, you know, is it IPPF, you know, Population Council, you know, such organizations. So that's where the technical expertise and, you know, and obviously the commodities, you know, the Depo-Provera itself. I mean, it was, you know, coming from Pfizer, negotiated through very dodgy, you know, deals with South African ambassadors, you know, in the United States and, you know, in other countries where they were, you know, where they were producing the drugs, you know, and some of these contracts for Depo-Provera, for an example, the country still stuck with them because they were long-term and binding. You know, and then fast forward to the transition from apartheid to South Africa, you know, because the forced sterilization that we're working on, we're struggling with now is sterilization of HIV positive women, but this is something that happens in the democratic South Africa, the people's South Africa. So this is what happens in the negotiations, you know, in the transition. So you have the African National Congress, which is a nationalist party that ushered South Africa from apartheid to post-apartheid. So the ANC in late 1980s rejects feminisms as a tool of analysis of oppression, right? They say all oppression is racial. Let's deal with racial oppression. You're distracting us if you want to apply the feminist lens. And what this does is that it silences all women's issues, that has to do with being a woman, but also with being, Black, and also with being born and living in South Africa. So women's issues, gender is silenced completely, from the struggle when, at the critical point when negotiations were starting, so obviously in that context, women's issues would not then be profiled as issues of oppression. I mean, for an example, the rape of women in South Africa and outside of South Africa, and also, during the struggle, and of course, forced contraception and forced sterilizations. You then have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is like, your transition tool, that is saying this is what happened and this is how we move on. So it leaves out forced sterilizations, right? And remember at the time, in international law, forced sterilization was already, so one of the worst forms of violence against women, but also torture, so the highest, grade of human rights violations, as it were. So it gets left out, then the ANC, through President Mbeki, issues one blanket statement that is apologizing to all South African women who faced violation in apartheid South Africa. So that's one, and obviously, into, post-apartheid South Africa now, we have women in parliaments, we have, activism, women's issues going in, but then when you look close, you realize that actually the women who went to parliament, I'm sorry to say this, colleagues, is that, they probably went in there as female bodies, representing their political parties rather than representing the interest of women, right? Because they'd been silenced even before, Black people took over government, so they're not representing women's interests, they, just female bodies, the politics of quotas, right? So they are not able to raise these issues, although some of them were personally affected by these particular issues, right? And then obviously in the negotiations, it's post-1994, right? The ICDP, the world is on steroids, about, ICDP, we're preparing for Beijing. So the country and the transition process is littered by the United Nations, technocrats, experts, the United Nations, UNFPA, everybody is assisting South Africa to write these policies, And of course, the policies are not going to look at the past. The policies are about how do we assist you to control your population, right? And yes, yeah. Then immediately after that, you have the HIV/AIDS issue coming up immediately after, like during the transition honeymoon, as it were, 1993, 1994. Then you have HIV positive women targeted for sterilizations. So the organization that I belong to, Her Rights Initiative, will represent over 80 HIV positive women who are victims of forced sterilizations. So the first case was documented in 1997, the first case that we have in our books, and the latest case was documented in May 2021. So this is something that has been going on for 3 decades, and obviously undeterred, so to speak. And okay, how do I get involved? Well, I'm one of the victims. I was sterilized in the 1990s, late 1990s. I was 22 years old, and I'm also living with HIV. So you find anger in what I'm saying, because I believe that the personal is political. So I have to, also, put my personal identity out there. Okay, so why does this happen? Why has it continued for this long? We think it's because of the AIDS policy, the global AIDS policy, to be precise, right? Which, initially promoted the prevention of mother-to-child transmission, again presented as reproductive health, right? So this was a program that was saving babies from mothers who had HIV. So if you were a woman living with HIV, you are pregnant, you are going to be given treatment just before you give birth to save your baby. Your baby gets taken out and the baby is given treatment, and you are no longer given treatment, right? And you had to do the C-section. It was compulsory for you to do the C-section to maximize the chances of, having a baby that does not have HIV. And obviously in a country where, women's issues were left like that, and then you see forced sterilization coming this side. Now you have given doctors access to women's wombs, right? And what do you expect them to do? They're going to cut something to try and save the world. And obviously if they cut women living with HIV, belong, women who are rather at the very bottom ladder of status in society. So it really, doesn't really matter. And obviously, because the prevention of mother-to-child transmission was a research project, you then had organizations that were funding those projects, PEPFAR, in particular, and there's a lot of research, that is out there about the impact of sterilization on PMTCT and all of that, right? Then you pass the phase where they were saying, oh, we're sterilizing you because we don't want you to continue to produce and leave orphans, and then you ask a question that says, well, if I'm going to die in 6 months, you are wasting the state money. Why are you sterilizing me? Why do you want me to die with this operation? I'm going to die, I'm not going to conceive, right? So we passed that phase, and then there was a phase of the AIDS treatment, right? Where there was now HIV treatment, but then sterilization continued. And in that phase, this is what happened. I mean, immediately, there was AIDS treatment at a global level, because all these policies are coming from the globe and they come, down to the countries. There was then a project of integrating sexual and reproductive health services into HIV services. This is a program that is coming from UNAIDS, UNFPA, WHO, and UN Women, as one of the co-sponsors, although it's not clear whether they have a role or not. So they are now integrating, and back to your first question, when you look at this integration, they actually are just integrating contraceptives, and countries are subjected to targets now, right? They must produce targets, then sterilizations goes up, forced contraceptions also goes up. You then have the broad South African reproductive health policies, right? The 2012 policy and the 2018 policy. So those policies, when you look at them, they target 2 population groups, HIV positive women and young women and adolescent girls, obviously they are poor and have high exposure, vulnerability to HIV infection. So those are the target. Similar situation with our national strategic plan on HIV. I mean, it basically says that by year 2027, it's like 75% of HIV positive women and young women, and girls should be using contraceptives. So that also drives, forced sterilizations of HIV positive women. Then, so when we started off, it was 22 women, it became 48, and today it is, it's over 8, it's about 85. Then on the statistic sides of things, we think—
Promise just one thing, because we are already kind of progressing in our time.
Okay.
Just that, because I have a few questions left for Andrea as well, but please continue to continue your point, of course. And I also wanted to say thank you so much for sharing that with us, because that is when we talked and when I looked into the topic of forced sterilization in South Africa, and specifically your bio, what you have already done with Her Rights Initiative, it was incredibly impressive. And that's why I wanted also to give this topic a bigger platform, so that you speak on this at depth and for us to understand why HIV policy has become has evolved in such a way, and why it is targeting these parts of the population. Thank you so much for sharing that. Please, if you want to add more to your point, you can do so. Feel free. I didn't want to interrupt. I just wanted to remind you of the time. That's all.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, so in terms of numbers, I'm talking about this because it comes out a lot. We think there are thousands of HIV positive women who have been forced into sterilizations in South Africa. The Human Sciences Research Council in 2015 released a study called the HIV/AIDS Stigma Index. The study is commissioned by UNAIDS, the South African government, the National AIDS Council, and many other international sponsors and or donors. So this study released that 7.4% of about 6,000 women living with HIV they interviewed reported that they'd been forced into sterilization in the past 12 months. So those would be the sterilizations that happened between 2013 and 2014, 7.4. We have a population of about 4.2 million women living with HIV in this country. And the same study revealed that 37% of the women living with HIV who participated reported that they'd been forced into taking contraception. What these findings basically meant is that, okay, so forced sterilization is not just a bad behavior of bad doctors. It's something that is systematic, it's clearly targeted, and it's a well-oiled state machinery. So we've been engaged in this work for almost 14 years, seeking justice for the women, working with different partners, mainly the Women's Legal Center, who are our legal representatives. All the advocacy, all the influencing has basically not worked. And we are now preparing for a case that will go into a court of law, a class action case. And what we've been doing to support this case is, research. Like, it's a long story, but I'll try to condense it. Because for years we'll speak to the state, and the state will say, well, what you're talking about is anecdotes, right? We will listen to you. We will act on this matter if you present it to us as research. Which is why activists like myself and others found ourselves in universities to say, oh, well, if there is power in the academy, we want to be there. And women who began to assist us in the academy with research, said, you better do that. So we've done research on the topic, and we're currently busy with 3 studies as we prepare for the court. So one study is, we are working with the University of South Africa to, document the impacts of forced sterilizations on women from a feminist perspective, right? Because for us, it's not about the cut, it's not about the operation, it's about what happens to you, to your life, thereafter. How forced sterilization intersects with your other identities and oppressions as a woman. We also are conducting a study that is documenting the mental health effects of sterilization. It is violence.
One question, sorry, the dogs, I think are a little bit interrupting. I can't hear you very well. May I interrupt you here, and perhaps you can share some links and information to the chat. That would be amazing to find out more about what it is that you are currently doing with the class action suit, and how you are preparing for it. Hopefully, I wish you all the luck and success with that. I did have one question left for Andrea before I get into the questions. Andrea, we haven't spoken enough about your e-paper, and it is I think, as I said, it's a very timely topic, and I would love to talk about it still in this panel. the fact what Promise has just described is, these measures to control how a population grows and which people kind of grow. I mean, it's something that is also happening in Europe as well. In your e-paper, you've described discourses in the European Union institutions that are leaning in the way of saying we want to control the population and the migration like that. And can you tell us a little bit about who is saying these things, who is leading these discourses, and why?
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot. So this is our collective paper. Let me stress that. So this is a work of 4 very dedicated professionals, and I would answer to this very important question in a way to say that demography, this word, is basically recording certain facts, right? So related to death, birth, and moving, right? So these are the 3 issues demography is concerned. And population policies are built on demographical facts. Those facts the demographers are actually presenting to policymakers. So that's why when we are talking about reframing this population policy, we have to go back to the basics, namely that what kind of facts are produced by whom and how. And this is this question which informed our paper, namely that we wanted to look at how the European level politicians, decision makers, the commissioner herself, the leaders of the different party families. Those who don't know that in the European Parliament there are so-called families, which is, I think, very telling as well, that they are voting together according to the joint so-called values. So how did they present facts? And that somebody is dead, right? That can be presented in so many different narratives. And population policy and the analysis of demographic facts are related to certain narratives. And that's where our paper came in and wanted to analyze how on Twitter, which is a very specific genre, a very specific space, but a very powerful space. And since Elon Musk just bought Twitter, it will get even more powerful, shaping the way how we think, how we get information, and how do we talk about certain things. So, and demography is especially the presentation of demographic facts, which is life, death, migration. They are very open for a kind of dramatic presentation. That somebody is dead, that's a sad thing. So, and lots of emotions are involved. And what we see now in this analysis of the Twitters, more than 6,000 Twitters messages were analyzed, that this narrative is used by the different conservative and increasingly by the far-right forces more and more. And the far right is actually taking over this discourse and eating up the space, the narrative, what the conservatives have. They are basically appropriating, taking over this discourse on 2 different directions. The first is normalization. So they are normalizing certain discourses via demography, that you are afraid of something, you are scared of something. So it's this concept of the great replacement is used by the far right, that the European population will be replaced by others. And if you move from Europe this replacement, that the Chinese are replacing what. So I mean, that this kind of replacement is very much present in the different far right discourses. The fear, right, to normalize this fear that you are afraid of the change, you are afraid of somebody move, birth, death. So this is and demography is very open for this. This is a kind of empty signifier in a sense. It's an empty category. These are facts which require a narrative to tell. And this narrative is actually hijacked. And the second is the polarization. So these political parties are aiming for a conscious polarization. And this is a new phenomenon in our present politics, that they are not aiming for coalition or consensus, but they are aiming for polarization. Because polarization is a form of governance, it's a modus operandi, and it actually somehow covers the fact that these parties really do not have too many original ideas, but they are polarizing the others, creating their own group, and they are talking to the own group via pointing out that the enemy is the other group. And demography is a fantastic narrative tool to do this. And the population policy is also a fantastic narrative tool to do this, especially because it's an empty signifier. It's a fact. Right? And also because those concerns, namely that there are few children who were born, or too many children were born, or too few people are dead, or too many people are dead, these are real concerns. I'm not saying that this is a real concern that there are too many people were born, but it's a bodily experience. It's an issue of actual issue. So it's a material, really concerning issue. So that's why it's open for hijacking and instrumentalization. So therefore, I would say that the population policy and the demography policy, they are extremely important and timely nowadays because they became, again, a contested field, not only among professionals and those who are working on demography and population policy, but it is becoming a major field of politics and policy making. And that's why, and let me again say, it is so important to have this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I have a question from the audience. It was actually, oh, sorry. Yeah.
I just wanted to comment one sentence, what you said.
Please.
What's important also for the German situation, that this hijacking is only possible of the far right. That's their terrain is population policy. It's all about population. The history of far right is connecting anti-feminism and racism and anti-migration policy. So it's biopolitics always. But the preparation of it was done by a lot of seemingly progressive talks about pro-natalist politics for middle classes, reconciliation of working and family, and so on. In Germany, by green and social democrat governments and so on, they started with this discourse, and I think we have already to start there. And one important issue is that it's always a nationalized discourse. Also on the development policies, it's always finging, making very simplistic arguments about national economy as if it would be a closed container, with national demography. And already there it starts to be a problem. Just one comment.
Thank you so much, Susanna. Andrea, we have received a private message from the audience. I think that kind of is a good follow-up question to that, which is, right-oriented governments in certain developing countries empower population growth as a tool of boosting nationalism, the commenter writes, where all the burden is on the women, ideally having 3 or more children, despite the country's poverty. So this is kind of like a comment on population growth as a nationalist weapon, quote unquote, weapon. Have you also observed something like that happening in the discourses on demography?
Yes, that's a very good comment and a very good question to historicize this whole development. So to connect the national greatness with the number of citizens they have, that goes back to the 19th century. And especially to Herder, so to the German concept that, you know, the more people a country has, the more future and better perspectives this country has. So therefore, from this point onwards, there was this discussion of having more and more, so the kind of extensive development of the population, and that's also that also drove the colonization and the colonial processes. But of course, here we have a problem that those who are on the colonies, they have a different skin color, and they are not necessarily fit into this image what the colonizer has. So therefore, certain policies needs to be introduced to make sure that those are reproducing who are the desirable population. And also, in the 20th century, the Stalinist Soviet Union and Nazi Germany also had this kind of policies of creating policy frameworks to encourage the desirable population to reproduce and the undesirable not to reproduce, or to eliminate that particular group. And that's why it's really important to underline the colonial connection between those policies and the colonial processes from the 19th century. And also you see this very paradoxically present in illiberal states now. So if you look at Russia, they are preparing for possibly banning the abortion, because as a militarized nation, they need more and more soldiers in the future. Also, if you look at Hungary, there are several policy measures in order to increase the number of Hungarians in the Carpathian Basin, which is also a kind of extensionist policy. So this comment is really important because A, it gives a historical perspective. Secondly, because it gives an overview of globally the connection between colonialism and also the population policies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Susanne, there was a comment in the chat that I think it's a very provocative question, but I saw that you had written about this, to be honest. So the comment goes, can we also mention the challenges of the sixth mass extinction of biodiversity and of wildlife and the planetary boundaries which underpin the survival of Homo sapiens? You have written about this, I would call this the very neo-Malthusian reflex, right?
Yeah.
And we observe this a lot in the climate debate. You have written about this as well. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, I think it's a new way of, again, blaming the number of people for a system of production, a system of fossil capitalism, a system of using social nature relations, which is about changing these relations, changing extractivism and changing fossil capitalism. And if we look at the numbers of people, we also see that it's so different which countries are really and which actors are really causing environmental destruction. That's absurd, I would say, to make the number of people on this globe responsible for that. And it's, I think it's like it's a kind of negating the problem of climate change if you look at numbers of people instead of looking at the real reasons of resource distribution, of extractivism, and also of the history of also genocide and land grabbing and all these destructive histories this like fossil capitalism, the capitalism has done. So I think it's like absurd to go in this direction. I know that there's some people also from climate discourse saying we have to make a birth strike, but I think it's more a media phenomenon that really the movements are thinking about. I was asked recently often about this, to say there is a feminist birth strike movement in the climate movement, and there is not really one. There is a lot of young women saying, maybe I don't want to have children. That's a totally other issue, because I want to engage in politics or because I have a dystopic view on the future. But that has nothing to do with blaming numbers of people or making population discourse. And even there's one birth strike activist who did this sometime in the UK, some singer, Pepino was called her name. She herself stopped her own campaign, saying that she didn't think that the power of overpopulation discourse is so strong that some institutions like Population Matters and others like this lobby groups who do this politics Promise has described so well, they hijack also this type of idea. So they said, no, we want to stop this discourse. So I think really it's an eco-terrorist right-wing thing that we have to really take care of, that maybe the right will will hijack this discourse too, instead of negating climate change. And this should be our main issue about it, and to look at the real reasons of production, consumption patterns, and changing of this global capitalism. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I understand the intentions behind statements such as we're running out of resources, or there's not enough to meet growing populations. But it's also important to think about the victims of these statements, right? When we're talking about resources running out, it's not because of population growth,
so
but it's a
distribution.
It's a mismanagement also of resources, of who gets to spend, waste what, how much. I guess we also, this is a really great question for all of you at the end. This is a question that we've received from also a private message. It's a very nice question. I love that, because I also had that in my own list of questions for you, which is, what are feminist strategies to make the racist and ableist, classist backgrounds of population policies visible? How can we fight back? How can we counter them? Promise, perhaps. Oh, sorry, you're mute, Promise.
Yeah. I mean, always a difficult question, but for me, I think it's what we are exactly doing today, or starting to do today, to politicize it, right? And also to target the source, and the source from where I'm seated is the international political economy, where these things are, developed, structured, where the real power is, and then begin to unpack, as to, where has it attached itself, and how do we disrupt it at that level, right? And understanding that if it's political, it also means it is systematic. Like my colleague is talking about the institution of demography, and I'm thinking that, maybe, you target that institution, and maybe also other research, fields. I mean, for an example, here in South Africa, we see a very problematic relationship between biomedical researchers and social scientist researchers. So these biomedical researchers, it's the funders in the West, that are, putting together all these studies, and then these studies, come here, and then the local researchers will supply population that will be, the research, and then social scientists, instead of raising, their critical questions about the phenomena, that they're presented with, their focus then becomes like focused on, the behavioral aspects, what are their beliefs, what is the behavior, and how can we use that to work for this particular program. You know, and also part of it is also building consciousness, feminist consciousness, you know, on women themselves, you know, so that women claim their power. I think you can only claim your power if you are conscious and you have power to do so. You know, and also to challenge the role that women get assigned, aid, you know, and in other spheres, you know, the role of care, to say it's appropriate that women are provided with the role of care, you know, all ought to be working with gender-based violence, for an example, you know, but actually, you know, women should be in a position where they are able to think, you know, look for change, strategic interest change, you know, change that will change gender relations in a more substantive manner, you know. So for me, that's what I would think needs to happen.
Thank you so much. Andrea, Susanne, is there anything you would like to add?
Yes, thank you. I think this is the $1 million question, as you would say. So I started my contribution about the narrative, right? So there are certain facts of lives, and how do you discuss that fact of life? And here I think feminist activism has got serious possibilities and serious responsibilities. That how do you talk about certain issues? And we are not powerless, I would say, because the concept of intersectionality was exactly developed by Crenshaw 40 years ago, when she was trying to analyze statistical data about the prison population and recognize that there are some white spots. Some people are not visible, some are not represented. So we are not helpless in trying to shape a kind of progressive political framework of talking about these issues. But these kind of new narratives are, we have a method, but these narratives are not coming from nowhere. And that's why we need more dialogue between the academics and the practitioners, because the academics are fine producing all these peer-reviewed papers, right? But how to translate all those peer-reviewed articles to political action, that is a problem, and that's something we haven't done before. And in the present context, this is a major historical mistake, that all that feminist knowledge has not been translated to action, and the knowledge production is not necessarily connected to the everyday experiences of women. So therefore, this kind of new narrative will come from this new dialogue, new forms of dialogue. One of this is this kind of webinar we are having now. And the third issue, what I would like to raise beside having critical intersectionality and to create a dialogue between academics and practitioners, is a new form of communication. This is not connected to the content which we need to produce as feminist academics, but the way how we are communicating. And if you read the report, what we did about the Twitter accounts, you see that the far right is basically monopolizing the discussion. So, and the progressive forces are not taking part of this particular exchange. So, and although we have a lot to say, I would say, so to participate in the discussions, go out and explain what are those problems we are identifying and how to solve that, and get into a fierce dialogue and debate with the others. That's the only way how to disseminate the ideas and to reach out for a wider population, demonstrating that there is an alternative. Because the most depressing finding in this report is that the alternative is not visible, although the alternative is there. So I just would like to encourage all of us to think about these 3 points, about intersectionality, about kind of cooperation and dialogue in knowledge production, and also a new form of communication, which is going out and very bravely engages with those who do not think the same way as we do. Because if we don't do this, then it will be, it has got serious consequences, like a kind of built-in civil war. Thank you. I was talking too much. Sorry.
Thank you so much. No, really valuable input, Susanne. The last is yours.
Yeah, thank you. You both already said a lot about it. I think maybe only to refer to Andrea. What is really the challenge is not to go in the same direction, making a different population discourse, but really to oppose it, to question it, to deconstruct it. Already, it's a very academic word. I think what reproductive justice activists all over the world are doing is exactly that, deconstructing this population discourse and showing what is about the crisis they want to solve via this demographic discourses. And another thing I think we can learn from the reproductive framework, as Black feminists have suggested, and as you will debate here also, is to oppose both, like this feminist northern pro-choice idea of how all women in the world have to behave and how they should plan and time and space their children, opposing this as a colonial and as a powerful discourse against all heterogeneous complex situations everybody is in. And on the other hand, also opposing like a right-wing patriarchal, also sometimes from, as Promise told us about the ANC, also from some patriarchal Black anti-imperial positions has been done and not seeing the interest of women. And there we have to fight for access to abortion and safe and not harmful contraception, and not this technical hormonal contraception, but there's a lot of other possibilities. We have to fight for it, but in a broad framework of basic healthcare, and that has nothing to do with all these development goals they are putting over it. And that's my third thing. We have in Germany really to oppose development narratives, development institutions, and also pharmaceutical industry who are working together and really to look close on these issues. It's still, there's such a lot of debate on assisted reproduction and a lot of other issues, but contraceptives and how they are part of this game and how they are implemented in a coercive way, there's very few exchange, and I think we have to go on with this exchange with people like Promise and other movements to know more about it, what happens.
Thank you so much, Susanne. I think there was a perfect transition to what I was going to say, because on May 10, we will exactly talk about contraception. That's our next discussion, May 10. But I want to say thank you so much to all 3 panelists. I think this was an extremely, extremely insightful panel, for me at least. I hope it was the same for you. Thank you so much for sharing your research and your expertise. Thank you so much, Promise, Andrea, Susanne, and thank you to the audience and your questions. And I hope we get to see each other again on May 10 on reframing contraception. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you too. To all of you.
Thank